Welcome to Acid Horizon. We are in an age that is increasingly defined by its drive to isolate, define, and optimize life. We are told that we are among the blessed if we represent our age in this way. And if not, we risk the salvation of all. We must accord with this liturgy of optimization or face the slow, biopolitical liquidation that sits on the other side of even the most minute of disobediences. We live in the consistent calculation of risk and security. There is no shortage of texts trying to grapple with, and often poorly, Foucault's concept of biopolitical modernity, but today's guest's approach is a little different. Our guest asks, what modes of thought brought about this government of the living? How did its object come to be known and to be manipulable and to be scaled to this concept of population? How have we found ourselves in the grip of this smart being? In the tradition of Tikkun, Agamben, and Foucault, Serene Richards is less interested in optimizing this optimization of life, like many polemicists of technology, but in showing that the innocent malignance of these systems needed a very specific form of thought to hold sway over the entire interpretability of our world. Biopolitics, for Serene Richards, must be understood as a system of thought. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Serene. We're really excited to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
Yeah, no, we're super excited. We don't cover Foucault as much as I'd personally like to. So it's always good to do a biopolitical episode. But I want to get started with the concept that you throw out in the preface, which is this notion of smart being. And what exactly for you is this being that is smart, and why does it sort of define or at least give rise to a particular way of approaching our biopolitical world?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question to start with. So obviously smart being is kind of put forward as, I suppose, like a caricature of subjectivity within techno-capitalist mode of life. It's the kind of being that is seduced by certainty, by safety, and is, let's say, fearful of anything to do with the uncertain, anything that might be a bit risky. So it's just a kind of way of going about life, trying to secure a kind of idea of success, a kind of idea of the good life that ultimately is dominated by the capitalist mode of production. Any kind of idea of enjoyment is enjoyment defined by the market or technological technological techniques. So, but at the same time, the idea of smart being isn't limited to a particular territory. So it's not that, certain people in certain countries, let's say like the UK, are smart beings. It's a kind of mode of subjectivity that is global and perhaps more clearly defined by a particular class. So yeah, what I imagine is probably someone who's, well-traveled, well-educated, and that really believes in the solutions of techno-capital.
One of the things that I find really interesting and really specifically unique to this book is that its object is biopolitics, but it doesn't take the standard route to the question of the threshold of modernity that Foucault calls sort of the biopolitical age. You make sure that the reader really first starts at the object of biopolitics, which is the living human being.
Mm-hmm.
And you take us through a kind of history of philosophical anthropology, which was at the core of Foucault's super early work. I mean, 20 years before Foucault would even start to talk about biopolitics, he would be writing about Kant's anthropology. And the standard sort of striation of Foucault's work is that there's the Kantian era, the Heideggerian, Dasein Analyse era, to the archaeology to genealogy, to ethics. And you kind of vanquish that distinction and show that sort of the entirety of Foucault's work sort of reaches this particular moment, this government of the living. So I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about the importance of Foucault's analysis of philosophical anthropology in the emergence of biopolitics in his thought?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. I think the way that I kind of approached making these connections was thinking, well, okay, if biopolitics is conceptualized as a technique of government, and we'll go into it in a bit more detail later on, then when Foucault obviously describes the anthropologization of philosophy, the function of the human sciences in delineating particular parameters to do with life, he talks about labor, he talks about other things, and these basically set up the parameters and the conditions of how life should be lived. And so I couldn't see how these could be disconnected. That obviously if government has to do with the living, has to do with organizing social life in a sense, then obviously the raison d'etat, as we could say, kind of derives from these forms of knowledge that were elaborated on in a very particular way, in a very specific way. So drawing from evolutionary biology, drawing from contemporary linguistics. And so I think that, for Foucault, that was really important. Yeah. And the key, obviously, is the inquiry into man. So as I go into it in the book, it starts from Kant's edition of the fourth question, what is man? Setting up man as both the object of knowledge and the subject of knowledge, and resituating himself throughout, retrospectively throughout the history of humanity as that subject. So I thought that was really interesting. And I think that particularly thinking about how Foucault frames that in relation to the connection to life and the living, to how we should live. Because obviously, whatever discoveries are made in, let's say, biology or in economics, then come to define politics, then come to define the question of, okay, well, how do we increase the minimum wage in this context, or how do we amend this policy in relation to this body of knowledge, this empirical study, etc. So the two are kind of connected and it function together, I would say.
I mean, if I could pick up on some of what you're saying regarding philosophical anthropology and its relationship to governance, I mean, I understand, in terms of philosophical anthropology, I think one of my main references, and Foucault's as well, is someone like Feuerbach. And I'm wondering if, in terms of the sort of the split that happens within the idea of the human, is there a split that occurs within the idea of the human that arrives on the scene at the same time as we're trying to do this philosophical anthropology? And so what I mean by that, just unpacking it a bit for the listeners, is there a split between, say, the essence of man and human beings, or the human, capital T, capital H, and human beings? And does that end up becoming something like the standards that, all of us, the essence of man partakes in all of us, and yet no individual human being is the human essence, is the essential, and therefore that becomes kind of like a governing principle? Is that the kind of split that's working here, a split between the species and sort of speaking for the species on the side of the governing sort of ideology, or the philosophical anthropologist who the government draws upon for their policy making, and individual humans themselves who, being particular, can ever be this universal object that is known in anthropological studies?
Oh, no, that's really interesting. I think that I would situate the split more in relation to the separation between essence and existence. So all these knowledges basically function mainly to inform, existence. So how life should be lived. So taking as given the idea of wage labor, etc. And the essence of the human being is thought to be kind of fixed, that it's the human being that's a political animal, that has language, that is rational, is a willing subject. So these are kind of taken as immovable. And the idea is then to govern existence so that it matches up with what's already been prescribed and defined as the essence of the human being. And so, if obviously, as human beings, we're unpredictable, we might not always act in ways, that might be rational, etc., then that is precisely what gives government its sense. Intervening in those aspects of our behavior or modes of conduct in order for them to then conform to a specific idea of human essence. And so for a long time, this was basically morality. Even statistics as a science initially started out as being called the science of morality. So the moral sciences, so concerned with deviance, concerned with unemployment or prostitution and so on. So philosophical anthropology functions in a sense to reinforce assumptions that are taken to be truths with regards to the essences, and then kind of providing the tools to manage, let's say, or govern existence to match up with a presupposed human essence, whatever it might be.
It's almost as if the points of governance in this sense is to humanize us, to humanize human existence, skin as if human existence is not human enough. And it seems that to go kind of dialectical about it, it seems that in a way this humanization has to bring a bit of contrary, that is dehumanization, established through that process. Because is that the case in terms of insofar as every particular human in existence is not the universal, is not the essential, they are therefore in a sense inherently inhuman and remain so through the process of governance. But that aspect is to essentially implant within them this essential thing which humanizes them, even if they are in a sense already human.
No, absolutely, and I think that that's a great way of putting it. It's a kind of it's a process that by definition is never ending, because one never reaches completion. There's always a training that one can undergo. There's always something else that one can do to better oneself, to better achieve or attain this degree of humanness, let's say. And of course, always in view with a view to something to a fictional kind of standard, something that doesn't really exist. And back in the 19th century, when Adolphe Quetelet, who was a statistician, astronomer, I believe, basically came up with this idea of the average man. For a long time, that served as the norm, the ideal standard that everyone should kind of attain. And of course, by definition, the average is no one. It's all the units of the population, to speak along those terms, are kind of contained in that. But it functions as a way not just of government, but also of self-government in relation to that particular norm. So it's a kind of rationality that allows for that to take place.
What's interesting here is that it sort of shows us the problems that we run up against when we sort of try to boil all of this down to a dialectical history, right? The emptiness of the normate is not something that says, okay, well, now we have to think in terms of the particular as opposed to the universal. It's such a decatonic structure sort of falls apart when we're talking about something like normalizing power, precisely because that exceptional space is empty. And what's sort of interesting here is that we talk about the individual, the subject, man. But one of the things that comes about in the 19th century, and you talk about this with separating or giving Foucault's account of Xavier Bichat and the clinic, is that this thing we call man, the more outside of this space of the norm an individual is, the more individualized they are, the more of an individual they become. So rather than sort of this clean distinction between individual who's, stripped bare of subjectivity and so on, in fact, it's a little bit more complicated, because with each of these like various attributes or trainings, there is a kind of individuation going on. And I'm wondering if there's anything in sort of the history of metaphysics, when you talk about the laws of social statistics, that give rise to this sort of paradigm of government that is in relation to sort of two things, like foresight and the norm. And, why was it important to bring the norm, which is something that's so crucial to Foucault's earlier work on discipline, into this space of biopolitics, which seems to have a much grander object, right? The whole of population and its mobilization.
Oh, definitely. I think essentially it comes down to evolutions in the mode of government. What I mean by that is a shift away, or a kind of new emphasis, let's say, with the idea of certainty and with the idea of the future. So making the future knowable, making the future certain, and so in a sense bringing the future into the present. So in the context of metaphysics, this would be trying to get a handle on the idea of the improper, either expelling that or integrating it somehow. With reference to language, constructing language as a science that isn't necessarily, that basically excludes anything that might not be grammatically correct. The idea from Lacan of la langue, the not all of language. And basically imagining or setting up, let's say, the ground or foundation as though these things can be separated out or excluded from thoughts, and all the while they continue to exist. But this gesture, this movement, then comes to be applied to individual behavior of conduct. And obviously when you have, the beginning of the work ethic in the 17th century that Foucault describes, for example, through the Great Confinement. So as Foucault basically says, the general hospitals where people were confined to during the Great Confinement didn't necessarily have anything to do with work, but rather to instill an ethic. And so you kind of have these movements, and at the same time, the 1600s, calculable probability, basically presenting the state with an image of the population, and therefore an image of trends, various trends that emerge depending on the questions asked. Obviously, this isn't something neutral. The interpretation of data is always subjective in a sense. And so, the norm allows for the government of the present, but also allows for making the future certain. But obviously, that's impossible. The more you look into the future, discover certain unknowns, the more unknowns then go on to emerge. And so it's a continuous process. If we think about how criminal justice has changed in the last, let's say, 30 years, the emphasis is more on preemption, stopping crime before it takes place. And so that's the origins of, let's say, actuarial justice, using methods of accounting in criminological practices. So I think this emphasis on the future and making the future certain is what's at stake. And particularly, thinking about smart being, that's the impulse that kind of dominates its life, trying to make sure that the future is known to a certain extent before it actually comes about or takes place.
In regards to this question of preemption, actually, one of the things that I'm really interested in is the history of preemption, particularly in terms. I mean, well, we all created did our, but that was one of the main things that thinking about the book is this concept from cybernetics of feed forwards, and I'm wondering how this connects to the contemporary state of smart being in terms of security, because one of the things that I think we tried to work out was this. There seems like there's an inherent self-defeating nature to biopolitical kinds of securitization, which is in their aim to preempt. Typically, we looked at a history of governance, and generally these systems tended to learn these feed-forward systems, these preemptive systems learn from their mistakes because feed-forward learn through feedback. But do we think that in a way that the constant need to preempt and the sort of the speed at which we can receive information about potential risks and potential futures, do we think that preemption in the way is, especially in contemporary sort of cyber culture or digitized existence, that this aspect of feedback is kind of being lost because the fear of error ends up being fear of the truth. To use that term from that quote from Hegel, that ultimately we can't preempt these things, and in our constant attempt to preempt all dangers, we're actually leaving ourselves more open to them overall. I mean, we can see this with the kind of ways in which negative feedback, for example, from sort of very tech bros, they don't take negative feedback well. The machines can't really learn anything because they've told their underlings they're going to work, and their underlings aren't going to get a job anywhere else, so they just say yes, they work, and they pat them on the head and give them a biscuit or something, and then a Cybertruck just cruises into a bin and explodes or something. Are we sort of reaching a sort of paradigm which these preemptive systems are getting a bit more accelerated, intensified, and indeed that's even more self-destructive in the kind of smart being that we are, at least in part, today?
No, exactly. I think that's a great point, and I think that actually highlights, the problem with smart being is that it's not smart at all. So, but we're all being kind of dragged along, as willing subjects in this kind of nonsensical experiment where things obviously, we can't really predict things in the way that we would like. The number of errors that the police make, for example, in preemptive arrests, and even, for example, a few years ago in the UK, it was like a lot of Black men were being diagnosed with schizophrenia, and without seeing any medical practitioner, without, that was just the police saying, oh, well, they must be schizophrenic, let's put them in prison. And then, so it's by, error is actually contained in its own mode of functioning. And I think that the problem for us is, how do we organize politically, in a sense, to avoid being caught up in this delusion? Because, the tools at smart beings' disposal basically functions in a way to kind of say, well, you're either with us or, you'll end up in prison. There's no way not to participate in this game, let's say. So, yeah, I think that is really the point of tension, and it, should be a side of politics of how do we kind of untangle ourselves from this path of destruction.
One of the things that's kind of interesting in taking up Foucault, though, and this concept of smart being, is that there's sort of this issue where you're running up against one of the big organizing principles of, let's use the negriest term, the counter empire or counter power, mobilizing this thing we call labor capacity, right? And one of the sort of great anti-post-Hegelian moves that Foucault makes in the early 70s is to refuse that labor is the essence of man. And we continue to see in polemics on technology, I think Bernard Stiegler is sort of particularly guilty of this, is that sort of the unsmartness of smart being is actually diminishing the possibility of a smart being and diminishing our potentiality. And Foucault runs up against this and says, so long as the human being is sort of reduced to or proposed as essentially a being of labor, of work, in a very existential sense, it's already entirely handed over to the machine that makes it work.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the resistance then becomes not just a sort of an active recognition, but also an active refusal of particular assertions about, or any really assertion about, the anthropological essence of the human being. And part of why I like smart being in relation to other, let's say, sort of conceptual personages, whether that be the docile body, Bloom, is that precursor smart inherits a kind of history of not just attunement to a particular goal, being oriented towards a particular kind of optimization, but an environmental element as well, right? Your smart TV is attached to your Wi-Fi, which is attached to your watch, which is attached to your smartphone, your smart car, and it produces a web of relations that one cannot escape. And it makes individuals extraordinarily easy to surveil, to police, but most importantly, to very passively and indirectly direct the human being. So you've arrived at this concept of smart being, but as it relates to the history of policing, can we see a direct relationship between sort of when I say technology, I mean in the most simple sort of day-to-day use of the term, the technological environment that we've produced and sort of an attempt at making these like set of relations that, say, the physiocrats did? And are you showing us a genealogy? Are you trying to place one on top of the other? What is occurring here in this relationship between these two milieus?
I think the two kind of do go hand in hand. And with reference to smart being, I think the question of policing is more of a kind of self-policing, the application of power onto oneself, being one's own sovereign, but also extending that to other parts of the world. So taking as a given its own kind of, let's say, the way it uses its tools, its own kind of epistemology, and then judging and policing those who are not yet smart, and basically applying a kind of surveillance and policing along those lines. And this is able to be, manipulated, let's say, on social media, on Instagram, for example, with smart beings kind of essentially showing off an idea of the good life, an idea of what's to be aspired to. And there's a kind of, I don't know if the right word is like seedy element, or just this kind of like huge discomfort, especially, I don't know if you saw this recently there was like a video circulating, I think it was from the US or Israel or somewhere anyway, that basically said, oh, imagine Gaza without Hamas. And it was this video of like hotel resorts, fancy restaurants, people smiling in like a really kind of insincere way, perhaps. And it's just that vision of the world that's kind of presented as the best case scenario, which is obviously a kind of soulless existence. But having that vision functions as a way of policing imagination, confining the imagination, collapsing it into something that is very depressing, alienating, commercial, let's say. These two kind of modes of articulating social life, whether it's kind of, the traditional idea of policing that kind of emerged with statistics, concerned with morality, concerned with enforcing the work ethic, that in a sense is absorbed into the idea of smart being, just using different tools of policing and self-management.
I think the example you just gave over from Instagram and the Zionist genocidal imagination is a very good example of the preemptiveness of smart being. I mean, remember once we were on a show talking about our book with an Israeli comrade, and he was translating this stuff, talking about why didn't they respond to their own intelligence systems? Well, because no one has ever said no to them, and they don't believe, they think they've already preempted everything with these magical systems. Which, if you look at any resistance videos, most of these anti-drone devices and they are just scams. You can fly drones up to them. And you can see in terms of their own military tactics, there's a smart being to them in the sense of, yes, everyone is trained for urban environments, but they also know they're sending in a conscript army who aren't very good at what they do. And so they do what my friends calls sort of derisively emotional support bombing, when they level the area around them and then, of course, make their own training completely useless. And in doing so, they still have forgotten how to preempt not standing next to an open window. I mean, this is kind of the the smart being of sort of rendered, because it is the most technologically advanced army in the world, supposedly, but that technology actually is only to secure a sense of their own securement, and that has left them completely open and completely unable to respond to error, in a sense. If anything, it's the cybernetic systems seem to have completely collapsed in on themselves. And that's interesting because one thinks of smart being, but it's I reminded of a quote from earlier in your book you take from Baudrillard about how artificial intelligence isn't just fake on the level of intelligence, because rather it's fake on the level of artifice, because true artifice comes in moments of contingency when security is simply up in the air.
Yeah, no, definitely, that's exactly it. And I think that, you know, what we're increasingly seeing is basically the kind of the breakdown of this kind of like fancy, shiny future, the real impotence of not just of the vision, but of the individuals who make it up. So the impotence of smart being, completely incapable, incompetent, not knowing, not only not knowing what it's supposed to know or what it kind of preaches, but basically can't even organize their own life, let alone, imagination, or it's basically forgotten how to breathe and is telling everyone else how to in a way.
And one of the things, though, that's so terrifying about this drive towards optimization, and you point this out in the book, sort of using Agamben, where you write, as Agamben points out, traditional political distinctions such as right and left lose their distinction at precisely the moment where biological life and its needs had become the politically decisive fact, and where the only real question to be decided was which form of organization would be best suited to the task of ensuring the care, control, and use of bare life. And this goes back to that distinction that you made earlier between sort of essence and existence that seems to be at the sort of tension point here, whether it's Xavier Bichat and the evocation of life, or say Rilke and creaturely life, or Benjamin and creaturely life, or Arendt. There are all these other attempts at trying to grasp this that come before Foucault and Agamben, but it's really in these two thinkers where it's actually the evocation itself that is the problem. And one of the things that you point out in specific and is the MAID program in Canada, which is, we've talked about it a few times on Acid Horizon, but we've never dedicated as much time as we should to it, which is the medical assistance in dying program, which is essentially a program that is really in place to eliminate life that has been deemed unoptimized. And as we have seen, there have been numerous tragic testimonies about disabled people who, for lack of access to living conditions that have been denied them by the government has instead ensured that they can, in fact, kill themselves if that's the issue that they've run up against. And one of the things that seems to be constantly lost is, in this eugenic history, distinctions of right and left are extremely murky. For example, the biggest proponents of eugenics were British socialists and American social democrats. And we tend to place eugenics really conveniently on this history of right-wing politics with sort of the extremely grotesque instance of Nazi eugenics, of Action T4, and of the Holocaust. But this eugenic mode of thinking hasn't left. It's not like with the Nuremberg trials, these things went away. And in fact, Karl Brandt, said that this question of euthanasia will return. And Agamben quotes that. And I would think part of what your text is doing is saying it not only didn't have to return, it never went away. So it's kind of been the principle of governance since at least the physiocratic age, but at the level of political ontology, the danger has always been there. And this you share kind of with Agamben in his work Stasis, right, where Agamben wants to show that sovereignty really is linked up. But when we talk about eugenics sort of being something that is shared by both the left and the right, we then have to look back again to your use of Foucault on the essence of man as labor, and show that maybe the organizing principles of left-wing politics, which is, again, this desire for a saccharine, clean, perfectly organized, perfectly rational life, is perhaps a little bit more fascistic than we want to admit, because at least in the 30s and 40s, a lot of left-wing thinkers were talking about how capitalism's fundamental problem is that it's an irrational organization of life, right? Or the irrationality of technical rationality. And instead, what could be brought forth is in fact a rational world that's rationally organized. And if this is the shared vision of both the right and the left, but the only thing that distinguishes them is the kind of policing necessary to achieve it, how can we understand, and this is of course getting to the later chapters of your book, a politics that releases ourselves from the necessity of clinging to this organizing principle of operation and of the smoothness of human operation?
Yeah, again, that's a great question, and one that's not obviously easy to answer, but it's definitely necessary to think through. And the problem is that once you have, let's continue along the lines of the question of labor. So once that is accepted as a human essence and something that all human beings need to participate in, then obviously, as you've laid out, the question for government, whether that's right or left, is simply to manage that process using tools that might vary. The practices are essentially, haven't really changed all that much from intellectual tools that we've inherited from figures like Francis Galton, statistician and eugenicist, the idea of, the mean, the average, etc. These things are very much alive in our thinking and not really kind of exceptions, as you've suggested. So another thing that these tools kind of make possible is to think of the human being as, along the question of value, not to value the human being, but to precisely assign it a numerical value, we could say, that either qualifies it for kind of, encouragement, support, or direction in a particular way, probably towards efficiency, productivity, or for annihilation. And biopolitics basically wraps that up in a sense and presents the idea of the individual as independent from the social network, let's say, that it might be, that it's living in, and masks the idea of human beings being expendable to a certain degree, that it produces a continuous stream of expendable individuals. So whether it's, for example, the idea of the click workers that make smart being possible, or even in environmental contexts, the huge amount of energy required in order for, a data center that nobody uses to stay alive whilst homelessness rates increase, etc. But it's that dynamic of a huge mass of expendable, let's say, lives used at the expense of what Aristotle would call the free man. So for Aristotle, the free person contains the slave as its own condition of possibility. So today, we could say the free citizen, the citizen of the UK, already, how contains the exploitation of thousands of migrants, let's say, who die in the Mediterranean. So, how do we go about organizing a different way of articulating politics is to recognize that dynamic and to refuse it, to refuse to participate within a system that basically takes that as a given. That is presupposed. That's not really something that we're supposed to be talking about. That's why in the UK, in the run up to the general election, it was, don't focus on foreign policy. Foreign policy doesn't really have anything to do with domestic policies, i.e., just forget about all that happening. So how do we think about things differently? Deleuze, for example, reminds us that it's actually what might appear to be furthest away from us that's actually closest and more kind of connected than we would like to think. And it's just to remember that. So for Foucault, going back to his work on the anthropology or his work on the production of knowledge, he's interested in the unconscious of thought. That's that which has been discarded from thought. In a similar way, the bits of language that we discard don't disappear. They exist as shadows to our mode of thought. So rather than assuming that the present is somehow a given, that the assumptions are basic truths, perhaps try to rethink those. And, this isn't an individual task. That's why, in the book, I try to experiment with this idea of what a collective intellect might look like, inspired from the writings of Averroès, Ibn Rushd, and Dante, for whom, the multitude cogitates that we might each have our own individual intelligence, but the intellect is collective. And that's something for all of us to kind of participate in.
No, I was wondering actually how this notion of collective intellects relates to the idea of institutions, or institutions as securities or based mechanisms. Because as you're mentioning the general election, I mean, well, the previous regime were mostly about stripping all these institutions apart, keeping them running as base management machines, and then sending it off to whatever ex viscount we failed to remove the head of a couple hundred years ago. But the current thousand Kia Reich we have right now is more about actually believes the institutions, quite viciously so, which is why the Home Office has announced, their new immigration raids, because we have the more competent fascisti in power in Britain now. And thinking about in terms of emboldening institutions, there's also a huge focus in your book about the question of destituent power, or something like deinstitutionalizing power. I want to ask how this notion of collective intellect relates to challenging biopolitical operations as they stand on the level of institutional thinking. Because in a way, these institutions rely on this separation between sort of life and the way it's lived in order to channel life through it as a kind of a battery. It needs to keep us moving through these circuits in order so that they have something to work on, be it the welfare system, be it what remains of our healthcare system, which is mostly about generating metrics for various pharmaceutical companies at this point. How do we challenge these things on the level of their own conceptualization as institutions, and how do you think that cashes out by thinking about it in terms of this collective intellect, this multitudinous rather than individual being? Because of course, as an individual, it would be hard not to relapse, as you point out, to something like Homo economicus, or this rational, just we have to make a map of the institutional territory, and then one of us, the brain genius, do that, and then the essential human to the operation draws the map, and then everyone else is channeled into the circuits to sort of reform the territory. But that's not what's happening here with this theory of the multitude.
Yeah, that's a great question. As you've said, the institutions that we rely on today, aren't even doing what they're supposed to be doing. If we think about it in the context of law, this idea of a rules-based international order that we're all being promised kind of exists at precisely the moment that it's supposed to be doing something with regards to the ongoing genocide in Palestine, it fails to. So it might put out statements here and there, advisory opinions, but it seems that, these things aren't necessarily enforced, and they continue to exist, perhaps just, symbolically. So how might we think of that differently? Well, in the first instance, the question to ask is, can we think of institution away from identity and representation, and away from setting up, having an institution with a view of a kind of transcendent principle that would then come to define its mode of operation? So to kind of do away with the idea of application and realization, and rather think of institution as something that has its sense precisely because of a form of life, rather than the other way around. So, the current setup presents institutions as that which kind of directs how life should be lived. So how can we collectively think of, in a way, the opposite? But obviously that's not necessarily something that's easy. But in law, the idea of institution, at least going back to Roman law, it had precisely that sense of instituting life in a way that isn't generalizable, but kind of functions in relation to specific ways of living, specific modes of life. And then, institutions kind of come about not necessarily as prescriptive or governmental or managerial tools, but rather just as a way, as a manner of life. And so that is definitely a question for the collective rather than for the individual, because it only makes sense in view of a modus operandi or modus vivendi of the multitude. Yeah.
I think that sort of one of the key questions in biopolitics as a system of thought is, how can we arrive at a sort of different approach to the question of life and the way in which it takes its form? And the answer sort of lies in a kind of the stakes are tethered between, how we exist and how our existence is intelligible. So in a certain way, part of the practice here is understanding how we've arrived at this point. In a certain sense, like, this is a practical philosophy. And I know that term has been just absolutely devastated. Like, it's like Rainer Sherman died, and now it's this horrendous Anglo-American, like, but one of the sort of problems is trying to take that step back, to sort of disengage. And this process of disempowerment is an extraordinarily difficult one, right? Smart being is not a threshold you reach, like, now you are a smart being, right?
No.
But it's a perpetual sort of insertion and reinsertion into a series of what maybe Hume would call incentives, right? Or Foucault would call disciplinary apparatuses, and trying to take a step back and not just be able to identify, okay, this is a result of cybernetic governance. This is, only possible once, let's say, like, the stockade of the asylum becomes the definitive mechanism of understanding, abnormal human experience. But getting to the basis of these things at the level of epistemology. And it seems like there are so many radical political projects that want to produce, let's say, an egalitarian future, but only on the basis of maintaining all of these various epistemic frameworks. So one of the core questions, I think, continues to be, and in this way, the book is kind of like, Diogenes of Sinope, sort of scratching at contemporary politics, saying it's like, well, how can you take all of the preconditions of liberalism and then say you've arrived at something else? And you make extensive use of the various analyses in Foucault's sort of mid-70s work, Society Must Be Defended. And one of the most sort of interesting comments Foucault makes is that socialism arrives and it has no governmentality.
Mm-hmm.
So it just borrows, it appropriates the entirety of liberalism. And to arrive now finally at the question, I feel like I'm at a conference, like, well, this is more of a comment. In this resurgence of, let's say, Rousseauianism that's occurring in political thought on sort of the left in places like the United States and the UK, isn't it possible to just see the replication of liberalism ad infinitum? And is that not part of the brilliance of liberal governmentality, is that it veils over all of the presupposed notions that make it possible and put forward an extraordinarily complex set of political relations that no matter what you do in dealing with those relations, those objects remain kind of unexamined.
No, definitely. And I think that is, that's partly the question that I was kind of asking myself when I was deciding to write this. It was precisely that, how is it possible that, we kind of continue to read critically, we're reading Foucault, we're reading Agamben and whoever else, and then in terms of political practice, it always comes down to the same thing, backing a certain candidate, etc. And that's partly what I wanted to understand myself. And I remember it was sometime during COVID where Isabelle Garot, she wrote an article on Biopolitics, basically saying that actually, biopolitics kind of depoliticizes and isn't a useful way of thinking about social emancipation, communism, etc. And I remember reading it at the time, and I reread it a few times, and I thought to myself, actually, to be fair, it is a good criticism of biopolitics. Okay, some of the theoretical arguments in relation to Foucault and Agamben might not be entirely correct, but that is the challenge. How do we go about organizing politically by not falling into the trap of the legal framework, which is biopolitical. It is an inheritance of liberalism, etc. That's just one example. But the question that I would pose to Isabelle Garot is that, well, not just her, but people who kind of take that perspective, is that, yeah, I fully agree. We need to organize politically. There needs to be mass social organization. And then, the argument that they put forward is that then you gain power, you get in, and then that's it. Then what? We've seen it happen many times where, whether it's in Chile, where, there was a huge, massive mobilization. First thing they decided to do after winning the election, okay, let's redraft the constitution. And then let's put that constitution forward to a referendum. And then, of course, they lose that referendum, and then the far right take charge. Or, what happened in Greece and what happens everywhere. There's a kind of underestimation, I would say, of international institutions, whether they're international financial institutions like the IMF or the EU, etc. There's a whole host of questions and presuppositions kind of cast aside. So whilst, I am sympathetic to the concerns, I would say that actually, perhaps there is a mystification there as well, or that they don't recognize a certain mystification, frankly, can also be described as depoliticizing.
This concept of depoliticization is a frustrating one, and we saw it emerge out of COVID, and it was extraordinarily opportunistic too. Like the thinkers that became sort of the stalwart, we need a new politics, were in fact like the stalest, had essentially the stalest proposals, which was just like, we got to take up Uber as a
you can say the words Ben Bratton will. It's fine on this podcast. He's not listening, and we don't like him anyway.
Benjamin Bratton's position was essentially we need a positive biopolitics, or Perotov, or frankly Nancy and Esposito, or like, oh well, we can democratize biopolitics. But of course, all of these things have resulted in perpetual catastrophe. And what this book, I think, really, really leaps into, and I think you share this with Agamben in a particular way, which is that so long as these things remain unexamined, and you take the entirety of the object of politics and then fight on that ground, you really can't be surprised when you take the right-wing position on the very ontological basis of politics, because you never fought it. There was never a fight put up to begin with. And your concept of counter-actualization, which I think is towards the, I'm trying to find it, which I think is towards the end of this book, is one that I think is extremely compelling. And when folks respond, well, it's very easy to simply wash your hands of it, the answer is no. It's actually really, really hard to find everyday ways of disengagement from these modes of production, from these conditions of existence. And in this sense, one of the things that I really appreciate about books like yours is that it searches for a politics that can't be confined to the parliamentary. And it shows that though the parliamentary system can produce this amazing spectacle of opposition, these distinctions are historically not as important when the object of management is the sacrosanct protection of the life of the population. And this is the justification that makes possible the kind of despicable attestations of, for example, representatives of the occupation forces in Gaza. They can say, well, 400 people can die because we had to take out someone we thought who might be somehow possibly someone who knows, maybe somebody who knows somebody who works with this member of Hamas. And this total mobilization of the population that is simultaneously extremely vulnerable, but at the same time extraordinarily powerful, and the source of all sort of vitality or vibrance of our government, is the trap that we ourselves fall into. And we can't be surprised when these occupation forces mock us with the entire history of really political ontologies that led up to this imperial object sitting in front of us. And in a certain sense, I think your book shows us the importance of how we interpret the object of politics before we start actually getting into the spectacle of what we call today, which is not political politics, right? And I'm wondering, as all of these things sort of circulate, you sort of make a bold gesture that there can be no guarantee. And why do you think it's important to resist that necessity of a guarantee? Why is it necessary to put forward the reality of disappointment?
Because I think it's important to not be put off by the possibility of there not being a guarantee, in order precisely to be able to act. Things, affects like fear, or I would say mainly fear, they're a huge obstacle to being able to think, because thinking necessarily involves a kind of disintegration, a kind of being lost, or it's some kind of struggle. And by believing in the idea of certainty, and then being disappointed when that never actually arrives, then one might then shy away from trying again, picking out different strategies, etc. So I think the fact that there might be no guarantee also kind of rejects a certain teleology, that actually this happens in the beginning and then that happens in the end, and we all live happily ever after. I think that ultimately, of course there's no guarantee, but that's not the point. We're always in the middle of things, as Deleuze would say, and we continue to be in the middle, and that's part of the process.
Well, I just wanted to thank you one more time for coming on the show. And perhaps one way that we can talk about this book is to say that really it is a book searching for the politics of the undefinable day-to-day work of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So for that reason, I really appreciate it. Adam, do you have anything to close with?
I could go on a diatribe about anthropology and cybernetics, but we don't want it to last another 2 hours. So I will park it there and say, Serene, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for having me, both of you.